Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and it's time to do another Patron's Choice video. For those of you who are unaware of what that means, it means that the topic of this video was actually chosen by the people who support me on Patreon in a poll. In fact, a poll that they can even choose to add topics to each month. So if you want to have a hand in deciding where this channel goes in terms of content, you can do so by checking out the link in the description below. Anyway, shilling over, let's get on with the video. There are a hell of a lot of ships in EVE Online, 345 of them in fact, so it's just a matter of distribution that some of them are going to be good, and some of them, well, are going to be about as useless as a chocolate teapot. However, not all bad ships are created equal, and some of them have a justifiable reason for it. After all, if I was going to rank ships by raw power level, the worst 5 would be the 4 T1 corvettes, and probably the worst of the faction corvettes, which likely looks like Immolator at number 5, then Velator at 4, Impera at 3, Ibis at 2, and Reaper at 1, which isn't a particularly interesting list now, is it? So rather than just looking at raw power level, what I'm going to be doing is looking at the power of ships in context. That means looking for ships that are completely outdone in their weight class or niche, or are just too expensive versus other similar options, or serve some supposed niche which is either rare or non-existent in the current metagame. Effectively, they're ships that if you see being used, they're either trying to throw you off, or are kind of making a mistake and using something suboptimal. Now I did fly a few other ships other than the ones that ended up on this list for research, so that I could see how the various shades of poop lined up against one another, but I'm going to give a few honourable mentions from that group just up front here so that I can explain why they didn't make it onto the top 5. First of all, we have the Griffin Navy issue, which is something that just utterly fails in its supposed role as an ECM boat, but as a frigate with 5 mids, it basically can't be bad due to the range control that offers, so it makes for a fun and viable solo PvP ship in faction warfare, as I've shown in a video of my own. The Proteus is still paying for the sins of the past, stuck with several underperforming subsystems like the drone synthesis projector and hyperspatial optimization that really hinder its flexibility, and a general lack of fitting space that means it can't utilize its relatively good slot layout. However, having the Cloaky Nully option is always going to give the Proteus some sort of niche, even if it is outperformed there in most aspects by the Loki. The Caracal Navy isn't actually that bad of a ship anymore, it just suffers from being one of the few missile cruisers to lack rapid light bonuses, which are a hugely powerful option in smaller fights. If HAMs or HMLs ever get buffed to be viable in smaller engagements, without having to have heavy application support, expect to see this ship slowly start to squeeze its way into the meta. And finally, the Ishka is a ship that I had firmly expected to be bad, just due to my dislike of mixed weapon ships, as they inherently reduce the efficacy of fitting any damage or application modules, as they only affect a fraction of your damage rather than the majority of it. But after playing with it for a while, it just feels like a slight variation on the Enyo, and it performs relatively well in that role. It's just not a particularly memorable or, in my opinion, interesting ship to fly. That's the honourable mentions over though, so it's time to dive right into the list, and number 5 here is likely going to be one of the most controversial ones, and that's the Stabber Fleet issue. Now, the venerable Stabber Fleet issue has a long history of being good in a variety of roles, being one of the few actually viable faction cruisers when I personally started the game back in 2008, as many of the others were just in a near unusable state at that point. It served as a great shield anti-tackle ship, an armor-heavy tackle brawler, a poor man's vagabond, something that really fit the Winmatar spirit of being a Swiss army space knife. Despite the hull not really taking a huge amount of nerfs itself, the ship has started to show its age, at least in my opinion, when compared to some of the newer hulls on the scene. Autocannon's roles as a premier anti-tackle platform has long since passed, with various nerfs and the takeover of rapid lights cementing medium autocannons, at least in my opinion, as one of the worst weapons available. Range control has also further increased in priority since the peak of the Stabber Fleet, and with only 4 mids, you have to make difficult choices about what ranges you want to fight in, and prioritise your build accordingly. In this case, I wanted to maximize my ability to reach and then hold an isolated target in scram range, which meant using a dual prop to reach that initial scram, and then an AB to ensure a speed advantage after an opponent's MWD drops off. Using this setup and an injector to keep my tanks going means that I'm unable to actually use a web, meaning that if I face another AB ship down the line, I won't have any speed advantage, and it also means that I can't punch down onto frigates. And this is the kind of problem that you're facing. You can only deal with one of those three threats at a time, at least for any sustained engagement. The one advantage you do have with the hull is its relatively decent fitting room afforded by great base stats and the native low fitting usage of autocannons, so throwing on a full tank, injector and dual prop barely makes the thing sweat. If you're trying to make use of the stabber yourself, you really want to keep that in mind and just pack the ship with as many tools as humanly possible because of the final big issue, and that is competition. Not only is the cost gap between it and pirate cruisers like the Cinnable and Orthrus closed as a result of burn emissions and incursions devaluing pirate LP, but so has the effectiveness gap between the Stabber's various fits and the other faction cruisers that fill the same role but in a more dedicated fashion. The reworked Vexor Navy and Org Navy just give it a massive run for its money in the Armor Brawler slot, with better DPS and tank on offer respectively, and the Scythe Fleet issue and the Osprey Navy both flat out are better than it as a shield anti-tackle ship. The Scythe Fleet is especially notable as an example because it has nearly the same effective DPS with the same platform in autocannons, but has a huge speed advantage, reaching over 300 meters a second more than the Stabber with an MWD. Whilst all of this combines to make the ship feel substantially weaker than it used to be, that's not to say it's completely awful. If you can catch someone out with the right fit, you're in for a really good fight, and trying to sculpt situations in such a way to take advantage of what you're set up to deal with is super enjoyable and a great skill to learn for aspiring solo PvP pilots. Of all the ships on the list, this is the one I had the second most fun with, and I definitely recommend throwing a few of them away on a weekend if you want to get plenty of fights and don't mind dying a lot. Number 4 on the list isn't actually one ship, it is in fact an entire class of ships, Valkysauria's favourite combat interceptors, consisting of the Claw, Raptor, Tyrannus and Crusader. None of these ships are, as frigates, especially bad ships. The Tyrannus is an upgraded Atron, the Crusader is a gimped Slicer, the Raptor is a better Merlin, and the Claw is a Jaguar basically made out of paper mache. But they do all serve the role of fast tackle relatively effectively, at least no worse than what simple paper stats would suggest when compared to their fleet interceptor counterparts. That is with the exception of one key factor. Fleet interceptors are completely immune to bubbles and combat interceptors are not. That means that not only do fleet interceptors have the ability to travel faster and more safely through hostile territory, but they can also position themselves more precisely on grid once they arrive at a fight, without the worry of being dragged by bubbles mid-warp. This has led to these ships being hilariously underused, with all 4 combat interceptors' total kills this month being less than half that of the least used fleet interceptor in the Eris, and less than an eighth of the Stilettos. Still, with buffs having just been announced for these ships at Vegas, I don't want to go too ham on the criticism. Whilst I suspect that just simple numbers buffs, which it seems like these are likely to be, won't do much to make them compete with the fleet interceptor role, the nerf to assault frigates that has also just gone through, which attacks their speed and ability to effectively serve as tanky interceptors, combined with it, might see combat interceptors move towards that role in fleets, providing a replacement for the Ramjag as a fast and tanky scram that can be used to leverage N+1 on kiting fleets in a home defense situation. Moving on and up to number 3, we start to get into the real stinkers of ships, things that are flat out beaten by cheaper options or just completely fail to fill their intended role. And thankfully the ship for this spot serves as a wonderful example as it manages to do both at once, the Armageddon Navy issue. Now, in theory, this ship is the heavy DPS brawler of the Amarr faction line, with the Apocalypse Navy serving as the longer range option. It takes the same bonuses that the pre-rework Armageddon used to have, with rate of fire and cap usage allowing it to dump laser fire downrange, and adds on some more base stats like armor HP and an extra high slot to give it more utility. Unfortunately, CCP forgot to give it anything in the way of fitting room to go along with that, so even this propless active tank fit that I put together requires a T2 ancillary current router and a 3% CPU implant to work, as well as an extra investment in faction lows. On top of that, its role as a heavy DPS brawler is overshadowed by its T1 counterpart in the Armageddon, which has both a better damage multiplier, giving 7.5% per level instead of 5%, and has 8 turrets to begin with, leaving the Armageddon Navy with 8.75 effective turrets to the Armageddon's 11, and given that the Armageddon gets a damage bonus, whilst the Armageddon gets a rate of fire bonus, the Armageddon even beats it in terms of damage per gigajoule of cap spent. Even if you're desperate for a laser armor battleship that has good DPS and utility highs, well, there's another option that, thanks to Delve, is far cheaper and offers way more power: the Balgorn. Given all of that, there's only one real reason to fly the Armageddon Navy, and that's hoping that your opponents underestimate you enough to fight like complete idiots, because they don't really know what the ship does. And you know what? It works. It works really, really well. I'm sure that after this video people will be a little more wary of the Armageddon Navy issue, but despite being a completely inexcusable pile of wank in many other regards, it's still a battleship that can put out a staggering amount of tank once you focus your build towards that, and over a long enough fight, someone will make a mistake and enter your sphere of death. The fights you get in an Armageddon Navy issue are vastly better than those you'd get flying in a Balgorn, not because of the power you're bringing to the table, but because of what your opponents feel they need to bring to beat you, because this ship is so bad. As such, I had a complete blast flying this ship, and it ended up getting caught and picked apart by a few cruisers. Its life was still a short one, but a blessed one, and one that came with much amusement. At around 600 million ISK, it's not something I can really recommend, but there are certainly worse ways to spend your ISK. Number 2 on our list is a venerable and perennial worst ship candidate, having been considered one of the worst ships in EVE Online since its introduction, and that is the Nighthawk. To put it bluntly, everything about this ship just sucks big floppy cocks. It's painfully slow, with a literal battleship in the Raven being faster than it with an MWD on, as the Nighthawk maxes out at 1020 meters a second, after taking what I assume is several centuries to reach that speed. Its slot layout is atrocious, with its limited 5 mids forcing massive trade-offs between tank, mobility and control, especially when combined with that speed making kiting a no-go. Its fitting is uniquely cramped for a command ship as well, thanks to the heavy demands of missiles and a shield tank, making an active tank basically impossible to weld onto the hull to give it some sustain in a fight. Even its traits suck, with it being one of the few ships that are left with a kinetic lock, meaning its damage bonuses only apply if Scourge missiles are being used, and those bonuses only apply to HMLs and Hounds anyway, and both of those platforms really struggle in both solo and fleet PvP, as they can rarely apply their full DPS to a target and have relatively low base damage to begin with. A pitiful 25% bonus to explosion radius won't affect that. The only way I could see this ship working in some way is in the vein of the old Podler Drake, using its incredible ham DPS potential and raw traits and shield HP as your primary tank, just simply hoping you can chew through cruisers whilst the rest of your gang takes the aggro as who's going to shoot the Drake first. However, as a slow ship with an obvious supporting role thanks to its boosts, this doesn't even seem like it's likely to work. Not only does its sister ship in the command ship line, the Vulture, outclass the Nighthawk in pretty much every respect, from range to DPS to tank to speed to fitting, being the default Caldari command ship in a fleet setting, but the Drake Navy beats it even in this niche role as a disruptive shield brawler for 250 million less ISK. Whilst its bonuses are slightly lower, the extra base launcher slots allow it to do even more DPS than a Nighthawk, whilst being able to achieve the same level of tank with a mid-slot to spare. Unlike with the Armageddon Navy issue, this ship doesn't even have value as a meme machine, so unless you're Reload, Suetonia or Alaska, looking to try and prove a point about how you're so good you can make an awful ship work, I would stay the hell away from buying this monstrosity. Now, for number 1, the head honcho of horrible, we have the only name-tanked ship in EVE Online, the Eris. Not the Ares, the Eris, the Galante Interdictor, so rarely seen that it often gets mixed up with the Interceptor. Confusing, huh? What should be less confusing if you open up Pythor is just how this ship took up the number 1 spot on this list. The Interdictor category is already somewhat dominated by the Sabre due to its extreme efficiency in filling the role that's needed in large fleets of holding your enemy down, then getting the hell out of there, which speed is effectively the only meaningful stat for. But the Flycatcher and the Heretic have found their niches in Small Gang or the Alliance Tournament, where their ability to shred tackle frigates whilst providing defensive bubbles is relatively useful. They're still fast, but their high range and relatively good tank make them better options if you want to do more than just get a bubble out of your Interdictor. The Eris, on the other hand, has not found a niche. It's still relatively fast, only 50 meters a second or so behind the Sabre, but it fails to provide in pretty much every other capacity. Once guns are fit to the Eris, it has less fitting room available than the Patron in the same state, and with an absolutely horrific 2 mid-slots, only giving you 1 to play with after you fit a prop mod. As we've talked about again and again, mid-slots are some of the most important in the game, just due to the fact that they are the main way you're able to interact with other ships and gain range control, so having only 1 option there severely limits what you can do. It basically leaves you with 2 options of what to do with the hull, MWD kiting or MWD brawling, and the Eris is good at precisely neither of these. Whilst you do have the range to kite with the Eris, you lack the speed and the damage to do so effectively versus pretty much any viable frigate, especially assault frigates, which can simply close on you with their ADC running and make the fight an unwinnable brawl as they're faster, and a beam retribution can actually do more DPS than a rail Eris. So if you decide to MWD brawl, there's a slightly better chance you might pick up a kill if your opponent isn't paying attention, but with only a scram to hold your opponents down and little in the way of sustain with no way to fit an ansil, it's one where you almost need to kill your opponents before they realise what you're trying to do, and it's why I've almost always seen them fit with a polarised neutron blaster fit. You can't even fit a bubble, the main reason for flying an Interdictor, whilst attempting to fill these roles. The Eris is just appallingly bad. Just to add insult to injury, as if being completely incapable of filling all those roles wasn't enough, we have a ship that can do both for only a few million ISK more, the Hecate, which is just a straight up better Eris in almost every capacity other than the ability to drop a bubble, which the Eris can't feasibly do anyway, making the Hecate the obvious first choice if you want a ship to fill any of the niches the Eris aims at. So that wraps up what I think to be the 5 worst ships in EVE Online right now, but as always I'm curious to hear what you think, as there's plenty of terrible ships to go around in the game. If you think I missed your own favourite turd, feel free to throw it in the comments and I'll get around to trying that ship sometime and seeing what can be done with it, as flying all these weird and not particularly good ships and trying to make them work was an enjoyable change of pace from trying to break the meta with obviously powerful options. I'd even encourage you guys to take out a few of these ships sometime, even if only as a bit of a challenge mode. A special thanks as always goes out to our Crassuses, Pinche Infidel from Old School, Brood from Triumvirate, and Zolka Lando, as well as to our other $5 patrons in Dustin Prater, Meeks, Zar, Olav Oldent, Kem, Raphael, Big Bada Boom, and Dunk Dinkle. If you want to support the channel yourself, you can either check out the Patreon link in the description below, or if you'd like, just share the video with someone who you think might enjoy it. Word of mouth is the best promotion tool I can ask for. Until next time, have a good day and fly smart.